You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, Episode 8, Rewind. Part 1, The Discovery. The sun hovered lazily over the Kansas plains, draping the landscape in a thick golden light that seemed to make time itself stretch and yawn. Max Campbell turned the wheel of the car with one hand, the other drumming rhythmically on the steering wheel. Ellie, tucked comfortably into the passenger seat, flipped through an outdated road atlas she had insisted on bringing. Her delicate finger traced their route, though she couldn't resist sneaking glances at Max, his profile strong, his demeanor carefree. The open road had been their escape, a self-declared honeymoon detour to savor the thrill of aimless exploration. A good road trip always has surprises, Max had declared that morning with his trademark optimism. It was this optimism that lit up his entire face when they passed a crooked, sun-bleached sign reading Flea Market. Antiques, treasures, curiosities. "Oh, we're stopping," he said, his voice laced with the sort of mischievous excitement that had endeared him to Ellie from the start. Without waiting for her reply, he veered off the highway and onto a gravel road, stirring up a cloud of dust that shimmered in the afternoon sun. Ellie smirked, closing the atlas. "Treasures and curiosities? You're such a sucker for these places." Her voice was teasing but warm, underpinned by the steady hum of affection. "And that," Max countered, his grin infectious, "is exactly why we're stopping. It's practically fate." The flea market sprawled across a flat expanse of land that had clearly been a field in its former life. Rows of tents and ramshackle stalls stood under faded banners and patched canopies, offering everything from rusted tools to porcelain knickknacks. The smell of funnel cake mingled with the sharp tang of sun-baked metal, and Ellie wrinkled her nose, though she followed Max with curious steps. Max weaved through the aisles with the ease of a seasoned treasure hunter, stopping to inspect items with the reverence of an archaeologist at a dig site. A vintage pocket watch here, a carved wooden duck there. Ellie trailed behind, only half interested, her gaze skimming over the dusty chaos. But Max, his excitement was palpable, his every movement charged with the kind of energy that made it impossible not to be drawn in. "Ellie, look at this," he called out, holding up what appeared to be a brass lantern. His voice carried an edge of awe, as though he'd stumbled upon Aladdin's lamp itself. Ellie arched an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "You're not seriously considering that, are you?" she asked, her tone dry but softened by the upward curl of her lips. Max grinned sheepishly. "Okay, maybe not, but it's cool, right?" He replaced the lantern with care and moved on, eventually coming to a stall that looked as though it hadn't changed in decades. Dust motes danced in the air as a rickety fan struggled against the heat. The vendor, an older man with a sun-weathered face and a cowboy hat tilted low, nodded at them without a word. His display was sparse but oddly captivating. Old cameras, film reels, and gadgets from another era. Max's eyes lit up the moment he saw the camcorder. "Whoa," he breathed, reaching for it like a kid spotting the ultimate prize in a claw machine. It was a Panasonic PVL559 VHS-C analog camcorder, its sleek black casing surprisingly well preserved. The buttons had the kind of satisfying heft that begged to be pressed, and when Max held it, he marveled at its weight. "A relic from the 90s, he murmured, turning it over in his hands as if deciphering an ancient artifact. Ellie glanced at it skeptically. "And what exactly are you going to do with that? Start filming home movies?" she asked, her tone laced with playful incredulity. Her arms were crossed again, though her expression betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Max grinned, flipping open the viewfinder. "Maybe I will. Or maybe I'll start a retro documentary series. The possibilities are endless." His voice carried an infectious excitement, a pitch higher than his usual tone, as though the camcorder were some magical key to untapped creativity. The vendor, who had been watching quietly, leaned forward with a slow, deliberate motion. "That one still works," he said, his voice gravelly but steady. "Got a tape in it, too. Almost new." "No way," Max replied, his eyes wide as he gently opened the compartment to reveal a VHS tape snug inside. "This thing's practically a time capsule." Ellie tilted her head, her curiosity winning out. "Does it actually work?" she asked, her voice softening as she stepped closer. Max looked at the vendor, who gave a slow nod. "See for yourself," the man said, gesturing to an outlet nearby. Max plugged in the camcorder, his movements careful but eager. He flipped a few switches, and after a brief hum, the red recording light blinked on. "It lives!" Max exclaimed, his voice carrying a triumphant edge. He held the camcorder up to his eye, peering through the viewfinder. The world took on a grainy, nostalgic hue, and he panned around the stall, narrating with mock seriousness. "And here we have the rare and elusive flea market vendor," he said, his tone a blend of humor and reverence. The vendor chuckled quietly, tipping his hat. Ellie couldn't suppress a smile. "You're ridiculous," she said, but her voice had softened into fondness. There was something undeniably charming about the way Max's enthusiasm transformed the mundane into something extraordinary. After a few minutes of testing, Max turned back to the vendor. "How much?" he asked, his voice tinged with anticipation. The vendor stroked his chin thoughtfully before naming a price that was surprisingly reasonable. Without hesitation, Max reached for his wallet, his grin widening as he handed over the cash. "You've made his day," Ellie said to the vendor, her voice carrying an undercurrent of amusement. The vendor smiled faintly. "Take care of it. That's not just a machine. It's memories waiting to be made." His words lingered in the air, oddly weighted, though Max didn't seem to notice. Back at the car, Max cradled the camcorder like a trophy, his excitement undiminished. Ellie shook her head, sliding into the passenger seat with a sigh that was half exasperation, half affection. "If you start narrating every second of this trip," she warned, though her tone was light, "I'm walking the rest of the way to Denver." Max laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. "Oh, come on. This thing's going to make our road trip legendary." He set the camcorder gently on the back seat, its lens catching the sunlight and casting a tiny prism onto the dashboard. As they pulled back onto the highway, the flea market receded into the distance, leaving only a haze of dust and the faint echo of the vendor's words. Ellie glanced at Max, his expression radiant with a boyish excitement she hadn't seen in a while. She felt a small, unexpected pang of gratitude for his spontaneity, for his unrelenting optimism, and for moments like these that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him. The car rumbled steadily along the open road, the camcorder nestled securely behind them. Neither of them could have guessed what lay ahead, nor the role that the dusty old relic would play in shaping the rest of their journey. Part 2. The Crash. The road stretched out ahead of them, a ribbon of asphalt unspooling across the Kansas plains. The late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in a blinding brilliance, its relentless glare bouncing off the windshield and making the world outside appear as a mirage. Ellie tightened her grip on the steering wheel, more out of habit than necessity, as the road remained empty except for their car and the endless expanse of golden fields on either side. Max, in the passenger seat, was lost in the camcorder's viewfinder. He panned across the landscape, his voice brimming with exaggerated excitement as he narrated the mundane scenery. "And here we have the Great Plains," he declared, the pitch of his voice shifting into a mock documentary tone. "Flat, featureless, and filled with a whole lot of nothing. Truly a wonder of the modern world." Ellie laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're terrible at this. Stick to accounting." Her voice was light, but there was a warmth behind her teasing. "Accounting?" Max feigned offense, pulling back from the camcorder and fixing her with a mock-serious stare. "Ellie, this is art. You're looking at the birth of a cinematic masterpiece." His words came out with a theatrical flair, a playful lilt that made Ellie smile despite herself. "Well, make sure your masterpiece doesn't include my bad driving," she quipped, flicking a glance at him before focusing back on the road. Max grinned, returning to his self-assigned role as cameraman. The viewfinder framed a solitary tree in the distance, its lone silhouette a striking contrast against the endless sky. He zoomed in, adjusting the focus, and began another monologue. "Behold, the tree of Kansas," he intoned, his voice dropping to a deep, reverent timbre. "Standing defiant amidst the monotony, a beacon of hope for weary travelers." Ellie rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the smile tugging at her lips. "You're impossible." Max panned the camcorder again, this time turning it to capture the road behind them. And behind us, whoa, hey, look at that. His voice shifted abruptly, no longer playful but curious, with a hint of unease. Ellie glanced at him, her eyebrows lifting in question. What? That truck, Max said, still peering through the viewfinder. Bright orange, coming up fast. Really fast. Ellie checked the rearview mirror and saw it too. The truck was a vivid, almost jarring shade of orange, and it was closing the distance between them at an alarming speed. Maybe they're in a hurry, she said, though a thread of doubt crept into her voice. Max pulled the camcorder away from his face and turned to her, his expression shifting to match her unease. Should we pull over? He asked, his tone cautious now, stripped of its earlier levity. No, Ellie said, her hands tightening on the wheel. Let's see if they pass. But the truck didn't pass. It loomed closer, its engine a low, ominous growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Max raised the camcorder again, capturing the truck as it filled the frame, its grille glaring like a predator bearing down on its prey. Orange, you glad our car's not that color? Max quipped, his voice attempting humor but faltering under the weight of the situation. Before Ellie could respond, the truck hit them. The impact was deafening, a cacophony of screeching metal and shattering glass. Ellie felt the car lurch violently forward, the seatbelt biting into her shoulder as the world outside became a chaotic blur. The sensation of weightlessness came next, terrifying and surreal, as the car flipped over, once, twice, before slamming back onto its wheels with a bone-jarring thud. Then, silence. Ellie's eyes fluttered open, her vision swimming with double images. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burned rubber and spilled gasoline. Her chest ached, her head throbbed, and her leg screamed with a pain so sharp it forced a strangled gasp from her lips. She tried to move but froze when she caught sight of Max. He was slumped in the passenger seat, motionless. His head rested at an unnatural angle, and his once vibrant eyes stared ahead, empty and lifeless. Ellie's breath hitched, her throat constricting as the realization clawed its way into her consciousness. Max? She rasped, her voice hoarse and trembling, barely recognizable even to herself. She reached out, her hand shaking violently, but the moment her fingers brushed his arm, she recoiled as if burned. He was gone. The finality of it crushed her, stealing the air from her lungs. A sob erupted from her chest, raw and guttural, the kind of sound that comes from a place too deep for words. But the world offered no comfort, only the unyielding hum of silence punctuated by the occasional crackle of a cooling engine. She forced herself to look away, her survival instincts kicking in through the haze of grief. There was no time to break down. Not here. Not now. She needed to move, to do something. Anything. Her gaze darted around the wreckage, landing on the camcorder in the back seat. It was miraculously intact, its lens catching the fading light like a tiny, defiant beacon. Ellie grimaced as she shifted in her seat, her injured leg protesting with a searing pain that shot through her body. Gritting her teeth, she fumbled with the seatbelt, her fingers clumsy and uncooperative. It took several agonizing seconds before she freed herself, collapsing forward onto the dashboard. The movement sent another wave of pain through her, but she bit down hard, refusing to cry out. Dragging herself toward the back seat, she stretched out her arm, her fingertips just grazing the camcorder. A surge of determination propelled her forward, and she managed to grab it, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. The weight of it was oddly reassuring, a tangible reminder that she was still here, still alive. Her next challenge was getting out of the car. The driver's side door was crushed, pinned against a jagged outcrop of dirt and grass. Ellie turned to the passenger side, her breath hitching again as her eyes briefly met Max's lifeless form. She forced herself to look away, choking back another sob as she pushed the door open with all the strength she could muster. The ground outside was uneven, a mixture of dirt and gravel that felt unforgiving beneath her hands as she crawled out. Once she was free of the car, she tried to stand, but her injured leg buckled immediately, sending her sprawling onto the ground. She cried out, the sound sharp and involuntary, and for a moment, she lay there, staring up at the vast, indifferent sky. "Get up," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking but resolute. "You have to get up. With a monumental effort, she managed to push herself upright, leaning heavily on her good leg. The camcorder dangled from its strap around her neck, bumping against her chest as she took a tentative step forward. Every movement was agony, her injured leg dragging uselessly behind her, but she pressed on, one excruciating step at a time. The road stretched out ahead of her, a cruel and mocking expanse that seemed to go on forever. She had no idea how far the next town was. 20 miles? 30? But there was no other option. With no cell service and no help in sight, walking was her only choice. The minutes stretched into hours as Ellie stumbled along the roadside, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The weight of the camcorder felt heavier with each passing step, but she refused to let it go. It was the only thing she had left, a fragile tether to the world she had known just hours ago. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. Ellie's steps grew slower, her body teetering on the edge of collapse. But she kept moving, driven by a single unrelenting thought. She had to survive. As the first stars began to pierce the twilight, Ellie's legs finally gave out. She crumpled to the ground, the gravel biting into her palms as she caught herself. For a moment, she lay there, trembling and defeated, the camcorder's strap digging into her neck. But then she looked up, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. A faint glimmer of light flickered there, just barely visible in the encroaching darkness. It was hope. And for now, it was enough. Part 3. The First Rewind. Ellie's legs buckled beneath her, and she crumpled onto the gravel road. The camcorder hung from its strap, heavy against her chest, its sharp edges pressing uncomfortably into her ribs. Every breath came in jagged bursts, shallow and desperate, her body trembling from the effort of walking what felt like an eternity. Pain radiated from her injured leg, a searing reminder of the crash that had left her stranded and alone. Her eyes stung, but she refused to let herself cry. Not here. Not now. The faint glimmer of hope she had seen earlier, a distant light on the horizon, had vanished with the setting sun, leaving her surrounded by suffocating darkness. The stars above offered no solace, their cold indifference only amplifying the ache inside her chest. She reached for the camcorder with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against the familiar contours of its body. The act was almost instinctive, a need to anchor herself to something tangible, something real. Turning it over in her hands, she thumbed the rewind button, not out of purpose, but as a distraction, a way to momentarily escape the weight of her grief. The world didn't fade away gently. It ripped itself apart. A violent swirl of colors and sounds engulfed her, as if the universe had been crumpled like paper and was now being smoothed back out. Ellie's stomach churned, and she gripped the camcorder tightly, her knuckles aching from the strain. Just as quickly as it had begun, the chaos ceased, leaving behind a disorienting stillness. She was back in the car. The familiar hum of the engine filled her ears, and the faint scent of Max's cologne hung in the air. Her hands were on the steering wheel, her body rigid with tension. She blinked, her surroundings blurring for a moment before snapping into focus. The golden Kansas landscape stretched out before her, serene and undisturbed, as though the crash had never happened. "Nice driving, hun!" Max's voice jolted her out of her daze. Her head snapped to the side, her heart skipping a beat. There he was, alive and well, his easy grin framed by the camcorder pressed to his face. His voice was light-hearted, tinged with teasing, but Ellie couldn't focus on his words. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. "Ellie, you okay?" Max asked, lowering the camcorder to look at her. Concern flickered across his face, softening his usual playful demeanor. His voice carried a note of gentle curiosity, as if he were trying to coax her out of a daydream. Ellie couldn't speak. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly that her fingers began to cramp, but she didn't let go. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But the weight of the wheel beneath her hands, the steady rhythm of the tires on the road, everything felt tangible, undeniable. "Ellie." Max's voice softened further, dipping into a tone of genuine concern. "You're scaring me. What's wrong?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She glanced at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. He was here. Max was here, alive, smiling, looking at her with the same easy confidence that had always made her feel safe. But she knew what had happened. She remembered the crash, the truck, the lifeless look in his eyes as she sat trapped in the wreckage. Her voice finally broke free, but it was hoarse, barely above a murmur. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. I'm fine. Just tired. Max raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he lifted the camcorder again, resuming his playful narration. Well, if my co-pilot's tired, I guess it's up to me to document this epic journey, he announced, his tone once again theatrical. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the thrilling saga of Max and Ellie versus the Midwest. Ellie barely registered his words. Her gaze darted to the rearview mirror, her pulse quickening. The road behind them was empty, stretching out like a ribbon into the horizon. But she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The truck would come. Her grip on the wheel tightened as her mind raced through possibilities. What should she do? Could she stop it? Would this time be any different? Hey, look at that, Max said, his voice pulling her attention back to him. He had the camcorder trained on the road behind them, his tone shifting from playful to curious. Bright orange truck, coming up fast. Ellie's stomach dropped. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced at the mirror again. There it was, just as she'd feared. The orange truck, its vivid color and almost garish contrast against the muted tones of the landscape. It barreled toward them, a predator honing in on its prey. Ellie, you seeing this? Max asked, his voice tinged with unease. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but her body felt frozen, paralyzed by the weight of what she knew was coming. Should we pull over? Max suggested, his tone cautious. No, Ellie said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. Just hold on. She swerved the car into the opposite lane, her movements jerky and desperate. The tires skidded slightly, the car shuddering as it adjusted to the sudden change. Max grabbed the armrest, his expression shifting to alarm. Ellie, what are you doing? He demanded, his voice rising with urgency. The truck mirrored her maneuver, its headlights glaring like twin suns in her rearview mirror. It was relentless, an unstoppable force bearing down on them. Ellie's hands shook as she gripped the wheel, her breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. She had to think, had to act. But nothing she did seemed to matter. Ellie, talk to me, Max shouted, his voice edged with panic. Before she could respond, the truck collided with them. The impact was brutal, a thunderous explosion of sound and motion that hurled them forward. Ellie's vision blurred as the car flipped, the world spinning in a sickening vortex. Glass shattered, metal screamed, and then nothing. When Ellie opened her eyes, the silence was deafening. She was slumped against the steering wheel, her body aching from the force of the crash. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning rubber and gasoline. Slowly she turned her head, her heart sinking as she saw Max, still and lifeless, just as before. A sob rose in her throat, raw and uncontainable. The camcorder dangled from its strap, swinging gently like a pendulum. Her fingers brushed against it, and without thinking, she pressed rewind again. The last thing she saw before the world dissolved was Max's still form, seared into her mind like a scar. And then, the chaos began anew. Part 4. Trial and Error. Ellie's hands trembled as she pressed the rewind button again. The camcorder hummed in her grasp, a sound that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. The swirling chaos engulfed her, that strange and violent sensation of the world being unraveled and pieced back together. Then, like a door slammed shut, silence. When the quiet lifted, she was back in the driver's seat. The golden Kansas landscape stretched out before her, the air heavy with the same tranquil stillness she had come to dread. Max sat beside her, alive, his camcorder raised and his voice filled with his usual good-natured humor as he narrated the mundane scenery. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to reach out, to grab him, to tell him to stop, to listen, to do something. But she couldn't. Her mind screamed with the weight of what she knew. The orange truck would come. It always came. And no matter what she did, it always ended the same. Max turned to her, his expression softening with playful concern. "You've got that 1,000-yard stare again, Ellie. What's on your mind?" His voice was light, teasing, with no hint of the storm about to break. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. Words felt futile. Instead, her fingers gripped the wheel tighter, and she forced her eyes back to the road. "Nothing," she said, her voice taut and thin, betraying the lie. Max's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he shrugged and resumed his narration, the camcorder whirring softly as he filmed the passing fields. Ellie's heart pounded as she glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind them was empty, for now. But it wouldn't stay that way. She knew the truck was out there, waiting. She just didn't know when. The first attempt. When the orange truck appeared on the horizon, Ellie's entire body tensed. She didn't wait for it to get closer this time. Slamming her foot on the brakes, she brought the car to a screeching halt, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed them whole. "Ellie, what the hell?" Max exclaimed, his voice sharp with alarm. She ignored him, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. The truck grew larger, closer, its menacing orange color vivid against the dust-streaked landscape. Her heart raced as the truck barreled toward them, showing no signs of slowing down. "Move!" Max shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Ellie, drive!" But it was too late. The truck smashed into them with devastating force, the sound of the impact ringing in her ears as everything spun into chaos. The car flipped, the world turned upside down, and then there was nothing but darkness. The second attempt. Ellie's scream caught in her throat as the rewind hurled her back again. The engine's steady hum, the golden plains, Max's laughter, everything reset like clockwork. She barely had time to catch her breath before the truck appeared again, a distant speck on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second. This time, she swerved sharply off the road. The car lurched violently, the tires bouncing over uneven ground as she steered them into the open plains. The tall grass whipped against the windows, the car's engine groaning in protest as it navigated the rough terrain. Max grabbed the dashboard to steady himself, his voice rising in confusion. "Ellie, what are you doing? Are you crazy?" "I'm trying to save us," she muttered through gritted teeth, her focus fixed on the expanse ahead. But the truck followed. Its massive wheels tore through the grass like it was nothing, gaining on them with terrifying speed. Ellie pushed the accelerator to the floor, the car rattling dangerously, but it wasn't enough. The truck rammed into them, sending them careening across the field until they crashed into a ditch. The last thing she heard was Max's scream before the darkness took her again. The third attempt. The world swirled back into place, and Ellie's breath came in ragged gasps. Her hands shook as she gripped the wheel, her mind racing. She couldn't stop the truck. She couldn't outrun it. Her options were dwindling, and with each rewind, her desperation grew. This time, she tried hiding. Spotting an abandoned barn on the side of the road, she veered off and steered the car into its shadow. The old wooden structure loomed above them, its weathered boards creaking in the wind. "What are we doing here?" Max asked, his voice edged with confusion. "Ellie, talk to me." "Just stay quiet," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of the truck. Her chest heaved as she struggled to calm her breathing, the silence around them deafening. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe they'd finally escaped. But then she heard it. The low, guttural roar of an engine. Her heart sank as the orange truck appeared, its headlights piercing through the gaps in the barn's walls. It didn't hesitate. With a deafening crash, it plowed through the barn, reducing the structure to splinters and obliterating the car along with it. The breaking point. Ellie's body shook violently as she returned to the car yet again. Her hands felt numb, her mind clouded by exhaustion and despair. No matter what she did, the result was always the same. The truck was unstoppable, unrelenting, an unyielding force of destruction. Her eyes burned as she stared at Max, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the camcorder's screen. He looked so alive, so blissfully unaware of the horror that awaited them. She wanted to scream, to cry, to beg him to take the wheel and drive them anywhere but here. But she knew it wouldn't matter. It never did. "Ellie," Max said, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out, okay?" His tone was calm, steady, filled with a quiet confidence that only deepened her anguish. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, she pressed the rewind button again, bracing herself for the chaos as the world unraveled around her. When the colors swirled and the silence returned, she gripped the wheel with renewed determination. Her mind was a storm of fear and frustration, but beneath it all burned a flicker of defiance. She didn't know how many more times she could do this, how many more crashes she could endure. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The horizon stretched before her, the golden plains unmarred by the darkness she carried inside. The orange truck would come. It always came. But this time, she vowed, she wouldn't go down without a fight. Part 5. The Revelation. Ellie sat behind the wheel, her hands gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel so tightly it creaked under the pressure. The air inside the car felt suffocating, heavy with words left unsaid. Her breath came in uneven bursts, and she risked a glance at Max. He was fiddling with the camcorder, its viewfinder pressed to his face, oblivious to the maelstrom of thoughts swirling in her mind. She couldn't take it anymore. "Max, I need to tell you something." Her voice wavered, cracking at the edges, but she pushed forward, determined. He lowered the camcorder and turned to her, his face bright with curiosity. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." His voice carried its usual warmth, but there was an undercurrent of concern creeping into his tone. Ellie's fingers twitched against the wheel. She had no idea how to explain this, no roadmap for navigating the insanity she'd been trapped in, but the weight of the truth pressed down on her, demanding to be shared. I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it," she began, her voice faltering before gaining momentum. "This isn't the first time we've been here. This stretch of road, this moment, this conversation. I've lived it. Over and over." Max tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense." His voice remained calm, but there was a faint edge of laughter, as if he thought she might be joking. "It doesn't have to make sense," she snapped, her frustration bubbling to the surface. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to soften her tone. "Max, I'm serious. Something is wrong. This isn't just a feeling. Every time we get to this point, something terrible happens." Max raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his seat. "Okay, let's say I believe you," he said, his tone cautious. "What happens?" Ellie's chest tightened. The words felt like gravel in her throat, but she pushed them out. "An orange truck shows up. It chases us. It crashes into us. And every single time, you die, Max." Max blinked, the humor evaporating from his expression. He stared at her for a long moment, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Ellie, this is crazy. How can you know any of that? How could you possibly remember something that hasn't happened?" She hesitated, the truth hanging heavy in the air. Finally, she reached for the camcorder resting on the dashboard. "It's this," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. "Every time we—" She faltered, searching for the right words. "Every time we crash, I rewind the tape, and we're back here. Back to this moment." Max's eyes narrowed as he studied her, searching for any hint of deception. "The camcorder?" he repeated, his voice skeptical. "Ellie, that's impossible." "I know it sounds impossible," she said quickly, desperation creeping into her voice. "But it's real, Max. I've tried everything to stop it. Slamming on the brakes, driving off the road, hiding. Nothing works. The truck always finds us. Max leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he processed her words. Okay, he said slowly, his tone measured. Let's say you're right. Let's say this is happening. Why? Why would someone go to all this trouble to… What? Kill us? Over and over again? Ellie shook her head, her frustration mounting. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out. There has to be a reason. Nobody does something like this without a reason. Max's gaze drifted to the horizon, his expression pensive. Okay, let's think about this logically, he said, his voice steady but serious. If someone's chasing us, it has to be deliberate. Maybe it's about money. Insurance fraud? People do crazy things for a payout. Ellie frowned, considering the idea. But that doesn't make sense, she said. Why would they target us specifically? We don't have anything worth stealing. We're just… us. Max nodded slowly. Fair point. Okay, what about revenge? Did we piss someone off recently? Cut someone off in traffic? She shook her head, frustration simmering just below the surface. No, nothing like that. We haven't done anything to anyone. Max leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. What if it's random? He suggested. Like, some psychopath who gets off on this kind of thing. There are people like that, Ellie. People who just want to watch the world burn. Ellie's stomach churned at the thought. The idea of their lives being reduced to nothing more than a sick game was almost too much to bear. You think they're doing it just… because they can? She asked, her voice hollow. Max shrugged, his expression grim. Maybe. Sometimes people don't need a reason. They just do things. For the thrill, for the power. Who knows? The car fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on both of them. Ellie stared at the road ahead, her mind racing. Could it really be that simple? Could the person behind the orange truck be driven by nothing more than senseless malice? But why us? She asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Out of all the people in the world, why us? Max turned to her, his expression softening. I don't know, he admitted. But maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is figuring out how to stop it. Ellie nodded slowly, her grip on the wheel tightening. She glanced at the camcorder resting on the dashboard, its sleek black casing glinting in the fading sunlight. It was the key to everything, she was sure of it. But how could she use it to change their fate? The orange truck appeared on the horizon, a distant speck against the golden landscape. Ellie's chest tightened as fear surged through her veins. She had seen this moment countless times before, but the dread never lessened. Her heart pounded as the truck grew closer, its monstrous frame bearing down on them like a predator stalking its prey. Ellie, Max said, his voice low and urgent. What do we do? She didn't answer. Her mind raced, cycling through every failed attempt, every desperate maneuver that had ended in disaster. But this time was different. This time, Max knew. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to change the ending. The truck roared closer, its headlights glaring like twin suns. Ellie's breath hitched as her fingers tightened on the wheel. She glanced at Max, his expression set with a mix of determination and fear. Hold on, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. We're not done yet. Part 6. Max's Perspective. The world returned in fragments. Max's head throbbed as he blinked, the swirling colors and chaotic sounds of the crash slowly fading into oppressive silence. He was still in the car, slumped against the passenger seat, the seatbelt biting into his chest. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His mind raced, searching for Ellie. Ellie? He called, his voice hoarse, cracking under the strain. Panic flared as he turned his head, his neck stiff and protesting the movement. She wasn't there. The driver's seat was empty, the door flung open and swinging slightly in the wind. The faint scent of burnt rubber lingered in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of spilled gasoline. Max fumbled with his seatbelt, his fingers clumsy and desperate, before finally freeing himself. He shoved the door open and stumbled out, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Ellie!" he shouted, his voice louder now, carrying an edge of desperation that he couldn't suppress. His gaze swept the area, searching frantically. Then he saw her. She was sprawled on the ground a few yards away, her body motionless. Her hair fanned out against the dirt, the rich brown strands catching the fading sunlight. Max's chest constricted, and he sprinted to her side, falling to his knees as he reached her. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice trembling as he leaned over her. His hands hovered over her body, unsure where to touch, where to begin. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted, but there was no rise and fall to her chest. No sign of breath. "Ellie, wake up!" he begged, his voice cracking. He shook her gently, then more urgently. The silence around him felt deafening, oppressive, as if the world itself had stopped to mock his grief. His eyes fell to the camcorder, still slung around her neck. The sight of it sparked something in his memory, a fragment of a conversation, her voice, urgent and insistent. "Every time we crash, I rewind the tape." Max's heart pounded as he reached for the camcorder, his hands trembling. He pulled it free and turned it over in his hands, his mind racing. Could it really be true? Could this strange, outdated piece of technology hold the power to undo the nightmare that had unfolded? He didn't hesitate. Pressing the rewind button, he braced himself. The world dissolved into chaos. Colors and shapes blurred together, spinning in a dizzying vortex that made his stomach churn. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the camcorder tightly, as if it were the only solid thing in a world unraveling around him. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. Max's eyes flew open. He was back in the car, the hum of the engine filling the air like a familiar melody. The golden Kansas plains stretched out around them, the horizon glowing with the warm hues of the setting sun. He turned his head, his breath catching in his throat. Ellie was there. She was alive, her hands steady on the wheel as she stared ahead, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. The sight of her filled Max with a wave of relief so intense it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. "Ellie," he said, his voice trembling. He reached out, his fingers brushing her arm. She glanced at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. "What?" she asked, her tone edged with confusion. "What's wrong?" Max struggled to find the words. How could he explain what had just happened? How could he make her understand the impossible truth he had just experienced? He shook his head, trying to steady himself. "It's nothing," he said finally, his voice quieter now, but filled with an undercurrent of emotion. I'm glad you're here." Ellie frowned, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced at him again. "You're acting weird," she said, her tone skeptical. "What's going on?" Max took a deep breath, the weight of the camcorder heavy in his lap. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "And you're not going to believe me." Ellie raised an eyebrow, her grip on the wheel tightening slightly. "Try me," she said. Max hesitated, searching for the right words. Finally, he held up the camcorder, turning it so she could see the screen. "This thing, it's not just a camcorder," he said. "It can rewind time. I don't know how, but it can. I just used it." Ellie stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried no humor. "Okay, Max. Sure. And what? We're in some kind of time loop?" "Yes," Max said, his voice firm. "Ellie, I'm serious. I just saw you." He paused, swallowing hard. "I just saw you die." Her laughter stopped abruptly, her face going pale. She turned to him, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" she whispered. Max's throat tightened, but he forced himself to continue. "The crash, the orange truck, it happened again, just like you said it would. But this time, I survived. And you didn't." His voice wavered, the memory of her lifeless body still fresh in his mind. "So I used the camcorder. I rewound the tape, and now we're here. Ellie stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. Max, that doesn't make any sense, she said, her voice shaky. How could that even be possible? I don't know, he admitted, his voice raw. But it is. You told me about it before, remember? You said this camcorder was the key. And you were right. She shook her head, her eyes darting to the camcorder in his hands. I don't remember that, she said softly. I don't remember any of it. Max leaned forward, his gaze intense. Because every time I rewind, everything resets. Except for me. I remember. And I need you to trust me, Ellie. I need you to believe me. Ellie hesitated, her hands tightening on the wheel. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on both of them. Finally she nodded, her expression still wary but softened by a glimmer of understanding. Okay, she said quietly. Let's figure this out. The car continued down the endless stretch of road, the golden plains rolling past them in an unbroken expanse. Max held the camcorder tightly, its weight a constant reminder of the impossible truth they were now grappling with. The orange truck hadn't appeared yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. For now, they had each other, and that was enough to keep moving forward. Part 7. The Breakthrough. The car rattled slightly as Ellie guided it along the unyielding stretch of Kansas highway. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, golden fields blending seamlessly with the pale blue sky. But inside the car, the atmosphere was taut, charged with a tension that made the space feel smaller, heavier. Ellie's hands gripped the steering wheel as she flicked a quick glance at Max. He was in the back seat, perched awkwardly with the camcorder cradled in his lap. His expression, usually so open and full of warmth, was tight, his brow creased in thought as he adjusted the device's settings. Neither of them had spoken for several minutes, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of gravel beneath the tires. Finally, Ellie broke the silence. Do you think this will work? She asked, her voice steady but tinged with an undercurrent of doubt. Max's gaze lifted from the camcorder, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. I don't know, he admitted, his tone measured. But we've tried everything else. If the truck is somehow reacting to us, maybe this will change the pattern. Ellie nodded, her grip tightening briefly before she forced her fingers to relax. She had to keep her focus, had to believe that this plan, however desperate and absurd it seemed, might be their only shot at breaking the cycle. She inhaled deeply, drawing strength from the steady rhythm of her breath. Max shifted slightly, his movements careful as he brought the camcorder to his shoulder. The weight of the device seemed to settle him, his posture straightening as he peered through the viewfinder. Okay, he said, his voice carrying a quiet determination. I'll stay low. Just keep driving like everything's normal. Ellie's lips twitched in a faint, humorless smile. Normal, she echoed. The word felt foreign now, a relic from a world they no longer inhabited. The first 20 minutes passed uneventfully. The road stretched on, monotonous and unchanging, the fields on either side swaying gently in the breeze. Max remained in the back seat, the camcorder angled carefully to avoid detection. Ellie focused on the road, her senses attuned to every sound, every flicker of movement in the distance. And then it appeared. The orange truck materialized on the horizon, its bright color almost garish against the muted landscape. Ellie's heart lurched, a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She forced herself to breathe, her hands steadying on the wheel as she glanced at the rearview mirror. It's here, she said, her voice low but firm. Max tensed, the camcorder's whir faint but constant as he began recording. I see it, he replied. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it, a readiness that hadn't been there before. The truck grew larger, its speed unnerving as it closed the distance between them. Ellie's pulse quickened, but she kept the car steady, her movements deliberate. The plan was simple. Act normal. Don't react. Don't give the truck any reason to escalate. What's it doing? Max asked, his eyes glued to the viewfinder. Nothing yet, Ellie said, her voice taut. She fought the urge to look back, keeping her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Just hold steady. The truck loomed closer, its engine a low, menacing growl that seemed to reverberate through the air. Ellie's grip tightened, her knuckles brushing against the smooth leather of the wheel. She could feel the tension radiating from Max, his breath quickening slightly as the truck drew near. And then, just as it seemed the truck would ram into them, it swerved. Ellie's breath hitched as the massive vehicle veered sharply to the side, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel. She caught a glimpse of the driver through the open window, a man with sharp features, his face eerily calm. He turned his head slightly, his eyes locking with hers for the briefest of moments. He smiled. The expression was unsettling, devoid of warmth or humor. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, a hollow gesture that seemed to mock her. Ellie's stomach churned, her breath catching in her throat as the truck roared past, disappearing over the horizon as quickly as it had come. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence inside the car was deafening, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Ellie's hands trembled against the wheel, her mind racing as she replayed the encounter in her head. "Did you see that?" she asked finally, her voice unsteady. Max lowered the camcorder, his face pale but composed. "I saw it," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "I got everything." Ellie exhaled shakily, her grip on the wheel loosening slightly. She glanced at him in the mirror, her eyes searching his face for something. Reassurance, perhaps. A sign that they were one step closer to understanding this nightmare. But Max's expression was unreadable, his gaze distant as he reviewed the footage on the camcorder. "That smile," he murmured, almost to himself. "What the hell was that?" Ellie shook her head, the image of the driver's face seared into her memory. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely audible. "But whatever it wasn't right." They fell silent again, the hum of the engine the only sound as the car continued down the road. The golden fields stretched out around them, unchanged, as if the encounter had never happened. But Ellie knew better. The truck might be gone, but its presence lingered, a dark shadow that loomed over them. "Do you think it's over?" Max asked finally, his voice hesitant. Ellie didn't answer right away. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, her mind churning with questions and doubts. "I don't know," she said at last, her voice steady but tinged with unease. "But I don't think we're safe yet." Max nodded, his fingers tightening slightly around the camcorder. "Then we keep moving," he said, his voice resolute. "We keep watching, and we figure this out." Ellie glanced at him again, a flicker of determination sparking in her eyes. "Yeah," she said softly. "We will." The car continued its journey, the golden plains giving way to the encroaching twilight. The tension in the air remained, a constant reminder of the battle they were fighting. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ellie felt a glimmer of hope. They had seen the truck, seen the driver, and they had survived. Part 8. Moving Forward. The road stretched ahead, bathed in the soft hues of an early evening sunset. The golden fields seemed endless, their gentle swaying in the breeze matching the rhythm of the car's tires on the asphalt. The world, at least for now, felt calm. Ellie leaned back in the driver's seat, her fingers relaxed on the steering wheel. The tension that had gripped her for so long was finally beginning to ease. Max sat beside her, the camcorder resting on his lap, its once ominous weight now nothing more than a nostalgic relic. He was quiet, his gaze flicking between the landscape outside and the device in his hands. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was reflective, an unspoken acknowledgement of the ordeal they had endured. "It's kind of surreal, isn't it?" Ellie finally said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was soft, carrying a note of wonder that she hadn't felt in days. Max glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Which part?" he asked. "The time travel? The truck? Or the fact that we're still in Kansas?" His tone was light, teasing, but there was a depth to his expression that hinted at the weight still lingering in his chest. Ellie chuckled, a sound that felt almost foreign after everything they'd been through. "All of it, I guess," she replied. "But mostly that we're here, together." Max's smile grew, his eyes softening as he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That part does feel a little like a miracle." They fell into silence again, but this time it was lighter, more comfortable. The miles rolled by, the scenery changing subtly as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Ellie's mind wandered, replaying fragments of their journey. The fear, the frustration, the unrelenting sense of helplessness. It all seemed like a distant memory now, though the scars it left behind were still fresh. "Do you think we'll ever understand it?" she asked after a while, her voice contemplative. Max tilted his head, considering her question. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be understood. Maybe they're just meant to be survived." Ellie glanced at him, her lips curving into a small, wistful smile. "You've been reading too many philosophy books," she teased. Max laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "Hey, you're the one who keeps leaving them lying around," he shot back. "I'm just trying to keep up." Their banter felt easy, natural, like slipping into an old, comfortable routine. It was a reminder of who they were before all this, before the endless loops and the suffocating fear. They weren't entirely the same, of course. How could they be? But the core of their relationship, the love, the humor, the unwavering support, remained intact, perhaps even stronger than before. As the first stars began to emerge, Ellie spotted a small roadside diner up ahead. Its neon sign flickered weakly, the word "open" barely legible against the dimming sky. "Want to stop?" she asked, nodding toward the diner. Max followed her gaze, then nodded. "Yeah, I could use some coffee, or maybe pie, or both." Ellie pulled into the gravel lot, the car crunching softly as it came to a stop. The diner was quaint, almost charming in its simplicity, with its checkered curtains and faded menu board visible through the window. As they stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon greeted them, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. They slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl seats creaking slightly beneath them. A waitress appeared moments later, her smile friendly but tired as she set down 2 menus. "What can I get you folks?" she asked, her voice carrying the easy cadence of someone used to long shifts and countless orders. Max glanced at Ellie, then grinned. "We'll take 2 coffees and a slice of whatever pie you recommend," he said. The waitress nodded, jotting it down. "Coming right up," she said before disappearing into the kitchen. As they waited, Max pulled out the camcorder and set it on the table. Ellie raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What are you doing?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Max shrugged, his grin turning playful. "Just documenting the end of an epic adventure," he said, flipping open the viewfinder. He aimed the lens at her, the tiny red recording light blinking on. "Say something inspiring." Ellie rolled her eyes, but she couldn't hide her smile. "Inspiring?" she echoed. "You're asking the wrong person." "Come on," Max urged, his voice light but coaxing. "This is your moment. Don't waste it." Ellie thought for a moment, then leaned closer to the camera, her expression mock serious. "Fine, here goes. Always keep an extra tire, never trust a neon sign, and don't mess with time." Max burst out laughing, nearly dropping the camcorder. "Brilliant," he said, his voice brimming with genuine amusement. "That's going in the highlight reel." Their laughter filled the small space, drawing a glance from the waitress as she returned with their order. She set the coffee and pie down with a bemused smile, then left them to their conversation. As they dug into their food, the mood shifted slightly, the lightheartedness giving way to a quieter, more reflective tone. Max set the camcorder aside, his gaze drifting out the window to the darkened road beyond. "Do you think we'll ever tell anyone?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. Ellie paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She considered the question, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Maybe," she said slowly. "But I don't think it would make much sense to anyone else." This, this is ours. Something only we can really understand. Max nodded, his expression pensive. Yeah, he said quietly. I think you're right. They sat in companionable silence for a while, savoring the pie and the coffee, the normalcy of the moment. Outside, the stars shone brightly, their light unmarred by the chaos of the past. It felt like a promise, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, the sky could still be beautiful. As they left the diner and returned to the car, Max picked up the camcorder one last time. He pointed it at Ellie, who was leaning against the hood, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the diner's neon sign. "What are you doing now?" she asked, her voice tinged with amusement. "Just one more shot," Max said, his tone gentle. "For the memories." Ellie smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes, warm and unguarded. She struck a playful pose, then laughed, the sound ringing out into the quiet night. Max hit record, capturing the moment as if preserving a piece of their resilience, their bond, their love. And as the camcorder's red light blinked steadily, the weight of the past lifted just a little more, leaving space for something new. Hope. The end.